I know. I feel it's like, all right, it's all right. Here we go. Okay. So I'm Alan. I'm with the State Historic Preservation Office. I do have a PowerPoint, but it's very minimal. We're going to go through things pretty quickly. I just wanted to kind of give you guys an idea of what we at the state are doing to help out Charlevoix right now. I get this. Are you all property owners within the area? I heard some talk. There's residential and business owners in here. So just kind of quickly give you an idea of what we're doing for downtown, primarily kind of the central core of Charlevoix. But if you have questions about how anything may apply to any other properties outside of that area that we're looking at, or other things that our office can help with, feel free to let me know. Like I said, we're gonna keep this pretty light. Just wanted to give an overview for anybody that may have interest in what we are doing. So in case you haven't worked with our office before, just a very quick synopsis of some of the things that we do. So our office has been around for a little bit, since the 60s. We currently are housed as part of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. So we're part of their community development team. I think they just renamed it the Economic Incentives and Development Team. But we work with the Main Street program, the Community Revitalization Program, all of those that work in communities to promote investment in downtowns and other related areas. Our office, of course, does strictly historic preservation, so that is our focus. So we work with communities across the state to help them figure out how preservation fits into the things that they're doing. So we have historians in our office, we have preservation planners, we have archaeologists, but that's our main job, is working with communities, working with local stakeholders in those communities to help them figure out where preservation fits or does not fit within the things that they're doing. And then to the extent that we can, we try to assist and provide incentives for those preservation activities. Just very quickly, why I'm here. So part of what our office does is we manage this program called the Certified Local Government, or CLG program, which is a program of the National Park Service that lets local communities partner with the state and the National Park Service to get access to specialized incentives for historic preservation. So any community across the country can participate in this program if they want to. Charlevoix is a participant in this. So I work with Lindsay, and part of what we're doing this program through the National Register nomination comes as a result of the city being in the CLG program. We currently have 38 communities in the program that range from communities like the city of Detroit to the village of Calumet and kind of everything in between. So right now in this area, we have you guys, Charlevoix, and Boyne City is also in our CLG program. So the great thing about being in this program is that it gives access to grant funding opportunities from our office. Our office does not have grant funding that's available to communities that don't otherwise participate in this program. So the only communities that can get money from us are those that participate in the CLG program, which is a nice thing because then you aren't competing statewide with every community across the state for grant funds that may come from our office. And then we do specialized technical assistance as well for those communities that participate, which is part of the project that we're going to talk about today. The other good thing about this program is for, in case you know anybody or you yourself may be involved with any organizations, the benefits don't only carry to the city, they also carry down to public entities and nonprofits within the community. So they can access our funding directly as well. And then we have certain other pots of money at times that are available to property owners. So it really is about the total of the community. Even if they're not doing preservation strictly as their purpose, if they work with historic buildings, if they're doing historic programming, heritage programming, there are different ways that they can tap into our incentives because the city took the initiative to be part of this program. Feel free to let me know if anybody has any questions. Like I said, we're just going to hit some stuff very quickly. So we're going to talk about the National Register. So we'll talk specifically about the project that we're doing, but what we're doing essentially is working with the city to list downtown, the central core of Charlevoix, in the National Register of Historic Places. So I just want to give you guys a quick background of what the National Register is, if you're not familiar with it. Really, at the end of the day, it's a list of important places across the country. That's what it comes down to. There are places every state that have been listed in the National Register. It can be individual buildings, structures, objects, as well as districts. So collections of different resources can be listed as a single entity, which is what we're talking about here in terms of the central core of Charlevoix. There are, of course, already listings in the area. This just through couple up on the here. So we have in the state of Michigan, I'm not gonna remember the exact number, but we've got 2,700, I think, individual properties. But again, with the idea that some of those are districts that may be districts of 100 properties or 1,000 properties. The actual number of individual resources, buildings, structures that have been listed are in the tens of thousands in the state of Michigan. Anything could be broadly considered for the National Register. This is a program of the National Park Service at the end of the day, so they set the guidelines for what gets listed. So while anything could be looked at for potential eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places, we're generally looking for three things, and that is that a property is at least 50 years of age or older. There are some exceptions to that at times, but generally we're talking 50 years of age or older. It has to have integrity, so it generally has to look like it did, broadly speaking, when it was built. Of course, there can be some changes and things like that that are okay, but you know, somebody from the time period would still recognize it as a product of the time that it was built. And then it has to be significant under one of 4 areas. So it has to be associated with a significant event or patterns of events. So like the Central Core of Charlevoix is significant, obviously, for community planning, commercial development in the city. Or a site could be associated with a very specific event. So for example, in some places we have sites associated with civil rights history or associated with education, those sorts of things. They can also be associated with important people or persons. They can be important for their architecture. So that could include, again, individual buildings as well as the collection of buildings. So again, thinking about the kind of central core of Charlevoix and all of the architectural styles and vintages of buildings that are represented is another area of why we're looking at this. And then the fourth is that a property could be listed for its information potential, which means really at the end of the day, it's significant for archaeology that is associated with that property. And there's actually several in the city of Charlevoix that have been listed because of their archaeological significance. So any buried resources and information potential, and so I think there are three or four in this area that have been listed. Strictly because of they are the potential research that can be found from the resources that are on that site. Yeah. So generally speaking, so it gets a little tricky. So when we're talking about a district overall, so like when we're talking about downtown here, we're primarily focused on the exterior resources, what they look like. We don't go inside the properties. What changes may have been made in the inside for a district. I'm going to say this loosely, but they don't matter at the end of the day. It's about the exterior of the property because it's really about that perception of the totality of the place as a district. What is the feeling of walking around that area? Does it still resemble kind of what it did historically? And there's bits and pieces of that may have changed, but in a general sense, can you still get that feeling? If you're talking about an individual property, however, and you're wanting to know, could that property itself be listed in the National Register? Then the interior does come into play at a greater level. So for example, typically speaking, when a house is listed in the National Register, we would ask that property owner or whoever's working with it document the interior character of that as well. So for example, did it have really elaborate woodwork on the interior? Is the general spatial organization still the same? It's not so much about the minutia of, they've replaced their the kitchen finishes or the functional pieces of the house, but can you still generally get a sense of, okay, well, this house was built in the 1920s or 1930s or whatever. So for those individual properties, when you're talking about the National Register, that interior does come into play a little bit more. That makes sense? Yep. Okay. And every property is a little bit different, even on the single side when you're talking about a single resource, because some properties, quite frankly, the interior never had any significant features, if you will. It may have been a very plain structure historically, so maybe there isn't anything there that you're looking for. Maybe the spatial organization is still the same, but maybe it never had fancy fixtures or elaborate woodwork or anything of that nature. When you get into other types of spaces, for example, if you there are a lot of schools that have been listed in the National Register across the state. Of course, schools change over time, especially if they are adapted for different needs. A lot of schools have been converted for housing and things like that. When we talk about spaces like that, it's really more about the public kind of spaces in those buildings. So, are the spatial organization of the corridors and classrooms still in place, even if they've been carved up for individual apartments or what have you? Can you still get a sense that this was a school from how it's arranged and things like that? So it's not so much about the individual pieces of it, but again, the totality of how that functions and what it's about.
Because the Charlevoix library followed that jurisdiction because it was the high school.
Yeah, so that's a case. Yeah, so yeah, so that's the case of where you're looking more so about how it functioned and if it, the current condition and character of it relates to what that function was, so even if it's changed uses or renovated, does it still have its main corridors associated with it? Even if the rooms off to the side are have been changed, are the entry vestibules, do they still read as functionally as an entry vestibule, associated with school, that sort of thing? Because you can make changes. I mean, the reality is that with any of this, places have to be usable and viable, or none of this makes sense at the end of the day. And so, you can have additions, you can have changes that have been made. Generally speaking, you want to see that they're sympathetic to the sort of character of the building. But you can have changes. It's like this building, for example, this building has had additions to it that are sympathetic to it. And then that sort of stuff is generally allowable. You can get into some very nitty-gritty conversations. If you're looking at different things like tax credits for historic preservation and what have you, it's down to the minutia of it. But generally speaking, we're looking at stuff that reads as it did historically.
So you indicated that the National Register is actually quite large, thousands of locations. Is that pretty much it for federal recognition, or are there other higher levels of entry and more of a specific nature, like to be kind of generic? Are there locations that may rise to a higher level that are designated something different?
Yeah, so there is one. So the National Park Service, so they manage the National Register of Historic Places, and they also manage what they call the National Historic Landmark Program. And so that Historic Landmark Program is that next tier up. That's kind of the best of the best, if you will. So generally, those are sites that are associated, that are significant for their association with an event or person at a national level. So it wouldn't be something that, it's significant only for its association with something that happened in that specific locality. But for, let's just take Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, which was the site of where desegregation happened. So that influenced policy and planning decisions about education all across the country. And so those types of sites, they can be nominated and designated at a higher level beyond the National Register. But yeah, that's a very, I don't know what the percentage is off the top of my head, but that's a very, very small percentage of the overall number of sites that have been listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
Are there opportunities for those locations financially that the status would allow them?
So there aren't funding sources specifically for national historic landmarks because they're a national historic landmark. So there are funding sources for properties that are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. We'll talk about those. There is one funding source that is only available for sites that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places because of their national significance. Even if they're not a national historic landmark, it gets very quirky. That's called the Save America's Treasures Program, which is a funding source that is only available for properties that are significant for their contribution to something at the national level. But they could be listed on the National Register. They could be a national historic landmark that could fall under one of these two pods. It's all kind of married together at the end of the day. So how does a property get listed? We're not going to work through this very long convoluted chart. Really what it comes down to though is a lot of education and documentation. That's how a property gets listed. So typically when a property gets listed in the National Register, whether you're talking about an individual property or a district, property owners can do it themselves at the end of the day. Some property owners do that. They love the history. They love getting into it. There are specific forms that have to be filled out that the National Park Service puts together that asks you about the history of the property, about why it's significant. You have to document all the architectural features of the property. If you're talking about an individual site, if you're talking about a district, you've got to talk about all the different architectural styles, how they fit into the development patterns that were happening. So we have a lot of properties that have been listed by property owners. By and large, though, because of the level of documentation that is often required by this, they're done by consultants a lot of times. Sometimes municipalities will do them, historical societies, other organizations like that will also do them. But a lot of times it's consultants because it's a lot more efficient for them to do the legwork that's associated with this. At the end of the day, it can take, we'll say, a year to 2 years and to get these things done. By the time you do all the work, by the time you put things into the package that has to go to Park Service, at the end of the day, you need the reviews associated with it. So it's kind of a laborious process at the end of the day that, you know, sometimes it's easier to say, hey, I want this done. You as a consultant do this, or hey, can the city help with a historical society? Again, it looks a little bit different depending on where you're at in the state in terms of how some of those entities may help out with property owners. For this particular project, we're kind of short circuiting all of this sort of stuff because we're doing this work for the city, which means one, it'll happen faster than it would if it was going by a consultant. And two, we're also doing it at no cost to the city. So the city doesn't have to go out and get a consultant to do something for a district nomination, which for something the size we're looking at would probably be 20 to 25,000, somewhere in that range. But again, because the city participates in the program that they do with our office, this is something that we're helping out with free of charge to the benefit of the property owners at the end of the day. So as part of this work, I will go through and do documentation of all the properties in the area. So I've done some of that before in previous visits, but I'll continue while I'm here. Doing photography, again, of the exterior of the properties, continue on research, and then I'll be the one that actually packages everything at the end of the day. Lindsay will help me out and review it and make sure everything is kosher and looks good from the perspective of the city. But we'll really facilitate that process and shoot it through all the different channels with what we call the State Historic Preservation Review Board, which meets 3 times a year to look at all properties that are being nominated to the National Register. And then to the National Park Service, we'll facilitate all that to get this done as kind of expeditiously as possible for the city. Of being eligible for the National Register?
Yeah, or being incorporated into the whole downtown thing or no?
So not for this particular property or project. And then I do have a map a little bit here that I will pull up and take a look at what we're going to be including. And that's, you know, and that generally speaking, even though we're only looking at a limited area for this particular project, I mean, there are a lot more properties in the city that qualify for the National Register. It could be listed if the property owners wanted to do that, again, either themselves or working with somebody. They're you know, just in having been to, you know, through the city myself, you know, 5 or 6 times that I've been in Michigan, there are a lot of great places and neighborhoods and collectives of resources that could very easily qualify for listing in the National Register. Again, if that was something that was desired by the property owners. So very quickly, what the National Register does or does not do, since that is often one of the hot topics of anytime you're talking about designation listing. Let's start with the does not. The main thing is that National Register listing does not limit what a property owner can do to their property. It has no impact whatsoever. A property could be listed in the National Register, and a property owner could decide they wanted to demolish that building the next day. There are no restrictions. You don't have to get approval from anybody to do anything. It's still your property, still do what you want. Likewise, it doesn't compel a property owner to actually do anything to their property. So it doesn't mean you're going to restore your property. You can if you decide to, but National Register, its listing itself does not force you to do that. There are plenty of properties that have been listed in the National Register that maybe are not maintained well or what have you. It's private property. It's not tied to anything like public access. You don't have to put up a sign. You don't have to let people in if you don't otherwise let them in. Again, everything stays private property. It doesn't change the functionality of what is happening. What it does do really is the National Register, again, it's an honorary listing. It's to recognize the importance of a place or places. But the benefit for property owners is that it opens up access to different types of incentives. So for properties that are listed in the National Register, there is a federal historic preservation tax credit that property owners can access. That particular tax credit is limited to, generally speaking, commercial properties. So we're talking properties that have a depreciable end use. They can get a 20% federal historic preservation tax credit for any qualified work that is done. We won't talk, I do have a basic slide. We won't talk in nitty-gritty of what that means, but more than happy to talk in more detail of what that does mean. For the National Register listing, it also will trigger the state historic preservation tax credit. And that includes for both commercial property owners and residential property owners. If your property is listed in the National Register, you do have access to the new state historic preservation tax credit, which is a 25% credit on state tax liability for any work that is done. So those are two tax incentives, and then does open up eligibility for different grants through our office, through National Park Service directly. So it really does open up the door for property owners who want to invest in their properties to kind of ease the pain that may be associated with that, because we know these projects can be very expensive to talk about this for. Yeah, so we have a basic slide. Not going to go through nitty gritty of how a tax credit works, but if you do have a commercial property and you are interested in what National Register listing may mean for you, let me know. We're always happy to talk through how that works, how it doesn't work. But again, at the end of the day, if you do have a property, generally speaking, commercial, and you're doing preservation work on that, you can claim a 20% credit on your federal income taxes. That works through our office, even though it's a federal tax credit. National Park Service manages that, but we're the ones that do the day-to-day work and talking to property owners, figuring out how that works. So again, we can talk more nitty gritty if that's something that's of interest to anybody at the end of the day. And then the state tax, maybe. State tax credit. Again, so this one's credit at your state tax income liability, and this one is a 25% credit for qualified costs. The really great thing about the tax credits for properties that are listed in the National Register is you can combine both the federal and the state tax credit. So you can essentially get 45% credit, of course, split across your state and federal income taxes. If you're doing a qualified project and you go through and provide the documentation that's needed associated with it. This one's a little bit different, whereas the federal credit is not a capped program. So anybody that qualifies, anybody that goes through the work can get that federal credit. The way that the state credit has been set up currently by the legislature is that it's capped at $5 million a year currently. Our hope is that that will go up over time, but that's what they've given us to play with right now. And so that's been set up in a couple of different structures. So $2 million will go to large commercial projects, those over $2 million. $2 million will go to small commercial projects, and then $1 million has been set aside strictly for residential projects. We're currently in the last leg of setting up the application process for this. If you are interested in the state tax credit, let me know. I can add your email to our contact list. So when we do webinars and things like that in the coming months, as we get this program rolling, I'm happy to share that information with you. The third thing that National Register eligibility opens up access to for certain types of properties, again, because the City of Charlevoix participates in the Certified Local Government Program, we offer grants directly through that program to communities. So there are a couple of quirky things with this. So through CLG grants specifically, we can't fund bricks and mortar work on private property. Park Service won't let us do it through this program right now. That being said, CLG grants can be used to do things like feasibility studies, market analysis. We've worked through some communities in the past to do facade studies of their entire downtowns to, again, facilitate those discussions with property owners. So there are different things that can be done to kind of facilitate that dialogue, take some of the legwork that really cues up property owners to be able to benefit from these things. For municipalities directly, or public entities or nonprofits, if they have properties within those areas that are listed in the National Register, they can get money for physical work on those properties. So historical society properties, city properties, all of those can get CLG grants through our office for physical restoration if they're listed in the National Register, either individually or as part of the district, like what we're looking at today. And then the last incentive, just wanted to mention that this will open up the door for property owners in the area we're looking at is our new Lakeshore Heritage Grant. So this currently is a one-time injection of money that we have from National Park Service to specifically fund physical work on properties in rural communities along the Great Lakes that participate either in the CLG program, the Michigan Main Street program, or the MDC's Redevelopment Ready Communities program. Charlevoix happens to be all three, so we're in plenty good shape there. So the great benefit about this program is it's only limited to a finite group of communities at the end of the day. I think we have 21 communities that are eligible for this pool of funding. The better thing about this program is it's accessible to any entity, generally speaking, within these communities. So the city itself can access this funding, nonprofits, public entities can access it, as well as private property owners that own a commercial, industrial, or community-oriented building. And this program is really about the economic impact of preservation, showing how these places can contribute to the viability of what we're trying to do in our communities. There's a lot of flexibility built into it. We do have our program guidelines developed for this program now. I think Lindsay may have passed out a flyer to you guys, but they're also on the table there. This grant program will start taking applications on June 1st and have a due date of September 1st. So there's 5 or so months currently still on the table to kind of get things together for this program. But there's a lot of flexibility built into it. I would say if you either have a property in the area that we are looking at for National Register designation, or somebody that has a property in the area, share this program with them. We would love to get some good applications. And so this is an area where, for example, having that National Register designation, it opens up the door because that's a qualification of this particular grant program from Park Service. Properties have to be listed in the National Register. And so by us doing this work for you guys on behalf of the city, again, it takes out that legwork to facilitate investment at the end of the day. So just another opportunity that's going to be immediately on the table. All right, so let's talk about this project specifically. So we're looking at what I'm calling right now the Charlevoix Central Historic District. So this project has been ongoing for a while. In terms of the city doing a lot of the legwork and volunteers doing a lot of the legwork to figure out if there's a potential viable historic district that could be listed in the National Register. Of course, as everybody knows, there has been some change downtown over time through that central core. And so originally when they started looking at this, they were doing research on all the properties, looking at the current character of the properties. And they started out by looking at this very small area that's shown in the dotted line there. About 15 properties kind of situated along Bridge Street and Ben Hell. That was the area that was originally looked at as for potential designation for the National Register of Historic Places, because that was the area that was considered to have the most integrity. It still, again, generally looked like it did historically, even though some buildings have been modified and what have you. So there were a lot of discussions about this in the early 2000s through mid 20-teens. A lot of our we had some assistance. Main Streets offered some assistance for some of these properties in this area. But conversations kind of stalled out and nothing was done to formally designate this area. When the city came into the CLG program in 2020, this was something that was immediately on the table in terms of a need, a desire that had been looked at for a long period of time. We offer, through the city's participation in the CLG program, what we call community partnership projects, which essentially means the community has a need. They may not have the funding to meet that need, but it's a need that would really impact the community. It would really incentivize property owners to do work on their property. It would help them out. It takes some of the legwork out for them being able to do these things. So communities can come to us, request that we do these projects, and then we go out and do it for them, essentially. So we're kind of, even though we're a state agency, we're kind of acting as the city's consultant to do this for them, again, free of charge to help out property owners within this area. So it's a little hard to see on the screen there, but So originally we were looking at that 15 property-ish areas situated along Van Pelt and Bridge. As you can see, we've opened up that pretty considerably. So there's a dark red line on that map. If you can see it, it's a little hard in the light there, but we're looking again essentially at that entire central core of Charlevoix, kind of the commercial and civic cluster of what was happening in the community historically. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, sometimes when you're looking at things for the National Register, there's a little bit of, people can differ in terms of what they think is eligible. So somebody that may have made a recommendation 10 years ago, that could look completely different to another person, just depending on what they're seeing, how we change, how we're thinking about the history of places. So that went into this discussion. Part of it also is that we really wanted to open up the door to maximize the potential to capture as many properties as possible. Again, to help property owners at the end of the day. This doesn't change anything they can do with their property, but if we look at a broader area, it just maximizes the number of property owners who could potentially access things like grant funding or tax incentives to do work on the property. Because once this is done, it's done. If they're listed, they then don't have to do any additional work themselves to go through this property to document that they are significant and they're listed in the National Register. If they're doing a project, they can just move fully into their project. They can work through the tax credit program and so on as they desire. Of course, if they don't want to work through any of that, they don't have to, but it just puts it on the table. So we are looking at a much broader area. So this will capture the entire commercial core essentially, but it also captures a lot of the civic functions of the community on the backside of that commercial core. So the city building, it will capture a couple of churches here along the core. It'll capture a couple of the historic residences as well that are right along that core that have kind of been, that their identity is pretty closely related to that kind of civic commercial cluster more so than a true traditional residential character. So at the end of the day, this is what we're looking at. This is where we're going. I will say it may shift a little bit over time as we kind of finalize things. Because what we will do as part of this process in terms of collecting the documentation, doing photography, we will go through, I will photograph the remaining buildings that haven't throughout this entire area, and all from the exterior. As we're going back and compiling things, we'll piece that together in terms of what the history of the community looks like, how what's there now relates to that history. So there may be some areas we kind of carve out to say, okay, well, we looked at this area, but maybe it's changed too much at this point, and maybe it doesn't make sense to be within this area. So there may be a little bit of finesse to it at the end of the day. But this is the broad area where we're starting just to have that conversation, because this is conceptually what we could have. Again, there may be some minor shifts within that, but we want to try and maximize that reach to the extent that we can. So I have questions about that, the boundary that we're looking at? So again, this will open up access to those incentives we talked about directly. So even though this is in process and it's not done yet, things like the Lakeshore Heritage Grant, property owners can apply to that because the only requirement for that grant is a property has to be listed by the end of a grant, which would be in 2024. So our listing will be done well in advance of that. So it opens up things like that immediately. Again, tax credits, depending on the program. A property can be listed as part of the process of accepting a tax or qualifying for a tax credit. So there are some immediate benefits to this on the table that don't have to wait until it is actually listed. Here's kind of a target timeline with where we're at. So I'm going to, my plan today while I'm here and tomorrow, I hope to finish the exterior documentation. I did some of this back in the fall, I believe it was, on a very rainy, cold, windy day. So today's weather will be much better for that. So I'm going to finish the exterior documentation of places within that boundary, doing the photography. I've been working on research remotely to the extent that I can. I'll probably come back and finish some in-person research and see you later on. And then this fall, we'll actually prepare the documentation associated with this. So again, all that research, all of the photography, everything has to be compiled into a very specific format for Park Service to accept it. We'll do all the legwork on that. The city will get a copy to review, and so we want to make sure it's accurate. And that includes other stakeholders that may have an interest as well that the city wants to share it with. Once that draft documentation is done, we have to again present that to the State Historic Preservation Review Board. They see every National Register nomination in the state before it goes to Park Service. They only meet 3 times a year. So our next chance to hit a meeting, they have a meeting in September, but we will not hit the deadline for that. So the next one will be in January of 2023, that we will hopefully have this presented at. Once they review it, they essentially sign off on it if our office says the property is worthy for the National Register. Because our office is doing the nomination itself, that makes that process even easier. It still goes forward for that review, but it's kind of a formality more so than anything else. Then once they review that in January, then everything gets sent off to National Park Service, and then they will typically we'll say within 45 days or so, get back and confirm a property is officially listed in the National Register. Or if they have some questions, there may be some give and take there. So broadly speaking, we're looking at spring of next year that this area will be listed in the National Register. And again, the good thing is once it's done, it's done. It doesn't have to be revisited. It can be revisited if the community ever wants to potentially add additional properties to that boundary. But there's nothing that says that actually has to happen. It can stand it as it is. And then for perpetuity, any property owners within there can take the benefits. So it's a very quick and high level overview of things. Do you have any questions? Threw a lot at you guys. There's might be questions not related to this.